Did Doc Holliday say I'm your huckleberry, or did he say I'm your hucklebearer? Or was it none of the above? 1994's Tombstone is arguably one of the most iconic westerns of all time. And what's not to like, right? Not only is it a great story, but it also features an all-star cast. Guys like Kurt Russell, Sam Elliott, Dana Delaney, and my own personal favorite, Val Kilmer. In fact, it was Kilmer who uttered the phrase that's now emblazoned on everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs. I personally own a coffee mug that says I'm your huckleberry. But is my mug historically accurate? Well, that's what we'll be discussing today. The seemingly endless debate between huckleberry and hucklebearer. And yes, we'll also take a look at what the real Doc Holliday said. You call down the thunder? Well, now you've got it. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. You're no Daisy. You're no Daisy at all. Yeehaw! Look, rather than drag this out with a long preamble, I'll just go ahead and cut to the chase. It's Huckleberry. It's always been Huckleberry, and it'll always be Huckleberry. What's more, if you give me just a few minutes, I can prove it. By the way, for those of you in the dark who have no idea what I'm talking about, I got to admit I'm a little jealous. But long story short, there's been this very persistent rumor floating around for quite some time, claiming that what Val Kilmer really said in the movie Tombstone was hucklebearer. Not huckleberry, hucklebearer. You see, way back in the day, casket handles were called huckles, and the term hucklebearer was synonymous with pallbearer. So in other words, when Doc Holliday told Ringo he'd be his hucklebearer, what he was really saying was that he was going to put him in the grave. Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, there's just one problem. Casket handles have never, ever, 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 ever in the history of all mankind been called huckles. And no, nobody in the South, or anywhere else for that matter, ever referred to pallbearers as hucklebearers, at least not prior to the late 1990s. By contrast, the phrase I'm your huckleberry, or some variation thereof, was indeed a well-known idiom from the mid to late 19th century. I know it really doesn't make a lot of sense nowadays, but it basically meant I'm the right person for the job, or that's right up my alley, pick me, I'm your man, I'm the guy you're looking for. Okay, fine, but how do we know this is actually the case? Or to put it more bluntly, how do you know I'm not just as full of shit as everyone else? Why trust me over all the other people on the internet saying the exact opposite? Well, let's go ahead and start with the man himself, Val Kilmer. He literally published a memoir in 2020 titled I'm Your Huckleberry. And it was in said memoir where he stated, quote, despite some fans' contention that in the 1800s the handles of caskets were called huckles, and thus the word hucklebearer was a term for pallbearer, I do not say I'm your hucklebearer. I say I'm your huckleberry, connotating I'm your man, you've met your match. End of quote. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe Val Kilmer just got his lines mixed up. Maybe the script said hucklebearer and he accidentally turned it into huckleberry. Very plausible theory, but then again, the original script is available online. I'll even drop a link down below if you want to check it out for yourself, and it does very plainly say Huckleberry. We also know that the guy who wrote the script, very talented Kevin Jarre, was influenced by historian Jeff Morey. Per John Farkas in his book The Making of Tombstone, Morey told Jarre, quote, I don't know if you're going to cover the confrontation between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo, but if you do, be sure to use the line from Walter Noble Burns' book Tombstone. I'm your Huckleberry, that's just my game. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Not only is Huckleberry in the original script, but it can also be found in the book that the script was partially based on, 1927's Tombstone and Iliad of the Southwest, written by Walter Noble Burns. Now, if you're not familiar with Burns, his book The Saga of Billy the Kid helped to turn William H. Bonney into a household name. And then the following year, 1927, is when Burns turned his attention to Wyatt Earp. Keep in mind that Wyatt Earp was still alive at this point. In fact, Burns even consulted with him. He also interviewed several of the old-timers who were living in Tombstone during Earp's feud with the Clantons. And according to Burns, the showdown between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo went as follows. Doc Holliday, second only to Wyatt Earp in the affairs of the Earp faction, remained standing in the door, a cold little smile on his cadaverous face. Ringo drew a handkerchief from the breast pocket of his coat and flipped a corner of it toward Holliday. They say you're the gamest man in the Earp crowd, Doc, Ringo said. I don't need but 3 feet to do my fighting. Here's my handkerchief, take hold. Holliday took a quick step toward him. I'm your Huckleberry, Ringo, replied the cheerful doctor. That's just my game. Holliday put out a hand and grasped the handkerchief. Both men reached for their 6-shooters. No, you don't, cried Mayor Thomas, springing between them. You'll fight no handkerchief duel here. There's been enough killing in Tombstone, and it's got to stop. End of quote. Remember, this comes from 1927, and Burns did speak with people who were actually there in the flesh. Now, I suppose you could say, well, maybe Burns also made a mistake. Maybe whoever shared that particular story said Hucklebear, and Burns erroneously jotted down Huckleberry. Therefore, what Val Kilmer should have said in Tombstone was Hucklebearer. And I do think that would be a very valid concern if we had any semblance of evidence showing that the phrase Hucklebear was ever used to describe pallbearers, or that casket handles were ever, at any point in time, referred to as huckles. But unfortunately, like I've already stated, no such evidence exists. I mean, you'd think if it was such a common expression, we'd be able to find it in old books or newspapers or maybe even obituaries. But I'm not joking when I say that as of this recording, you cannot find it anywhere prior to the late 1990s. Now, by contrast, we do know that various versions of I'm Your Huckleberry were indeed used throughout the 19th century. Not only that, but in many cases, it was used in the exact same context as it was in the movie Tombstone. According to the great researcher and author Matthew Kearns, the phrase was, quote, part of a broader Southern idiom, a huckleberry over a persimmon, meaning just a notch better, a cut above the rest, or slightly beyond one's grasp. Now, Matthew has a great article on this, which I'll also link to, and he even goes so far as to provide an excerpt from the March 28, 1840 edition of the Daily Chronicle out of Augusta, Georgia, defining the phrase huckleberry above a persimmon. Quote, in our South, if a man attains distinction, it is said of him that he is a huckleberry above his neighbor's persimmon. A very similar definition can also be found in the August 20th, 1868 edition of the Sydney Morning Herald. And over time, the phrase just sort of evolved and was eventually shortened into I'm Your Huckleberry, which, once again, per Matthew Kearns, was a way of describing someone who was slightly better, sharper, or more capable. Quote, exactly the kind of flair you'd expect from a well-read Southern gambler like Holliday, letting his fellow Southern rival Johnny Ringo know that he's met his superior. Okay, so now that we've established the etymology and provided some real-life examples of huckleberry over a persimmon, what about the shortened version? Are there any similar examples of I'm Your Huckleberry being used during the 19th century? The answer is a resounding yes. Like on January 28, 1873, when the following ad read in the Lincoln Journal-Star, quote, we are selling the very best Lancaster flour for $3.25 per sack. Other brands of flour, $3, cornmeal, $1 per 100, other grades of goods at the same rates. If you want number one choice family groceries that will please everybody, we are your Huckleberry. Or how about on July 12, 1877, when the Central Missouri Herald ran a poem which stated, in part, quote, I said she was the queen of the girls, the fairest girl ever born. She laughed and shook her sunny curls. I am, yes, in a horn. I whispered, bending down my head, your lips are like a cherry. She took my meaning, laughed, and said, well, I'm your Huckleberry. But wait, there's more. On March 7th, 1879, the Weekly Mercury published a story titled Bribed by a Kiss, in which a temperance lecturer failed to gain pledges on a recent trip to Michigan. Quote, he appealed in vain for recruits in the temperance cause. Not a man would move. At this stage in the proceedings, the belle of the town sprang to her feet and cried, boys, this is really too bad. Won't you sign the pledge? Not a soul moved from his seat. Again, the fair belle appealed to the men's better nature, but it was to no avail. They had promised they wouldn't sign. Finally, the lady said, boys, I'll kiss the first man who signs the pledge. At this juncture, up jumped the tall backwoodsman and drawlingly exclaimed, sis, I'm your Huckleberry. Where's your pledge? Skip ahead to July 14th, 1881, and the Nebraska Herald published a somewhat humorous story about two men betting on a mule race. Quote, Mr. Mink called out to Tim Curtis, the driver, come now, Tim, I'll bet you $50 I can pick out one mule that will beat either or both of the other two. Several well-known horsemen who wished to see the sport go on were standing about, and encouraged by him, Tim Curtis replied, well, Mr. Mink, I'm your Huckleberry. And look, I could go on and on. February 26, 1888, Morning News out of Savannah, Georgia, published a short story in which a railroad man tells a potential investor, by gosh, I'm your Huckleberry. And if you actually read the text, he's using it in the same way as Val Kilmer in Tombstone. It's very clear that he's explaining how his company is not only better than the competition, but that they're also up to the task at hand. March 2nd, 1886, The Middle Georgia Argus ran with a similar story about a stranger looking to purchase some land. Quote, "Do you know where I can buy a good piece of oil property?" And the tall Westerner replies, "I'm your huckleberry, stranger. I've got an immense bargain here for the right kind of man." In other words, if you're looking to buy a good piece of oil property, you have come to the right place. I've got you covered. By the way, if you're currently listening on Spotify or any of the other podcasting apps and you can't see the visuals I'm showing on YouTube, I do have screenshots for every single one of these articles. Screenshots that I have taken directly from newspapers.com. I've also been listing the dates in case you want to look them up for yourself. These are actual primary sources. And really, that's what this entire debate comes down to. Evidence. On one hand, we have many examples of the phrase "I'm your huckleberry" being used throughout the 19th century as a way to describe someone willing to accept a challenge. And on the other hand, when it comes to hucklebearer, we have nothing. Like I keep saying, no such evidence exists prior to the late 1990s. So why do I keep bringing up the late 1990s? Well, big shout out to listener Eddie for this next part, but he recently sent me a link to an online forum from way back in 1997 where a guy was using "I'm your hucklebearer" as his signature. And when he was asked about it by other members of the forum, he responded, quote, "I found a bit of info on a webpage that said hucklebearer meant pallbearer in the Old South," end of quote. And that's it. That is the earliest, at least as far as I'm aware of, where you can find any reference to hucklebearer being synonymous with pallbearer. There is absolutely nothing in any old obituaries or old newspapers or dictionaries or anything like that. Nothing but internet rumors that didn't crop up until after the release of the movie Tombstone. So if there's no evidence, then why do so many people still believe the rumors? Well, I think it comes down to a couple of things. First off, it does sound very believable. I remember first hearing about it like back in 2007, and my initial reaction was, well, that makes sense. Wasn't until a few years later that I started looking into it and realized it was based on a myth. Another reason I think it's gained so much traction is due to people with a certain amount of authority or expertise also repeating it. I'll give you a great example. There's a very nice lady on YouTube, well over 100,000 subscribers, Carrie the Mortician, and she posted a video a few years ago titled "What is a Hucklebearer?" in which she claims that casket handles were once known as huckles. Therefore, a hucklebearer is another way of saying pallbearer. Now, do I think she was purposely or maliciously spreading lies? Absolutely not. What I think happened was she heard the story from someone else. She found it interesting. It was adjacent to her normal type of content. So she decided to share it with her audience. That's it. And we are all guilty of this, by the way. There is not a person alive who hadn't heard a story or some type of interesting factoid and then shared it with their friends. That's just human nature, and we all do it. Hell, I used to tell people that Paul from the Wonder Years grew up to be Marilyn Manson. Or how about the story about Mr. Rogers being a sniper in Vietnam? And the reason he wore those sweaters was to cover up his tattoos. Oh yeah, I repeated that one for years. And to be honest, I kept on repeating it even after I learned it was bullshit. Mostly because I wanted it to be true. So the idea that people would spread the hucklebearer myth in a similar fashion without knowing that it's a myth really isn't all that surprising. Another example comes from an article published in 2020 titled "I'll Be Your Hucklebearer." Glenwood Springs historian Bill Kite sheds light on Doc Holliday's myths 133 years after his death. Now, I think a lot of people, myself included, would consider Mr. Kite to be an expert on all things Doc Holliday, especially considering that he spent a decade working as executive director of the Glenwood Springs Historical Society. And during the interview, he does state the following, quote, "That line in the movie, 'I'll be your huckleberry,' that's actually hucklebearer, which is the piece of hardware on a casket that you carry the casket with," end of quote. Now, when I first came across this, I decided to reach out to Mr. Kite just to see if he could provide some additional sources. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it really was hucklebearer and he knew something that I didn't. So I gave him a call. Now, keep in mind that this was about 2 years ago, I think. It may even have been 3 years ago. And I did not record our conversation, so you'll just have to take me at my word. I also want to be very clear that this was not a confrontational conversation. This wasn't a struggle session, okay? And I certainly wasn't trying to scold the man. This was a very cordial, friendly conversation where my only goal was to locate a source regarding hucklebearer being synonymous with pallbearer. And when I finally got around to bringing it up, no sooner did the words leave my mouth than Mr. Kite readily stated that he had been wrong in the aforementioned article. Turns out that he was simply repeating a story he had heard, just like everybody else. But yeah, I can totally see why someone would read Mr. Kite's statement and take it at face value without verifying the information for themselves. Once again, this is just human nature. But as far as there being any actual evidence that Huckleberry was ever a thing at any point throughout history, it simply does not exist. And for those of you who disagree, just do me one favor, okay? Before you start sending emails or leaving comments, my only ask is that you search out the evidence for yourself. Don't just tell me to do my research. Don't just send me a TikTok or some random AI-generated article. Show me an actual verified text from the 19th century proving that Huckleberry was another way of saying pallbearer. Once again, I know Huckleberry doesn't really make sense to our modern ears, but that's actually pretty common, right? Words and phrases fall out of style all the time. Hell, just imagine how confused people are going to be in another 100 years trying to understand stuff like 6'7" or no cap or skibidi. Also, if you're one of the many people who helped spread the Huckleberry myth, please don't feel bad. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you're gullible. All it means is that you're human. There's not a single person alive who hasn't also shared stories that weren't true. So with all this in mind, did the real Doc Holliday ever say anything about huckleberries? Well, unfortunately, nobody can say for certain. Like I said earlier, this comes from just one source, the book Tombstone and Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. And while Burns did indeed speak with all those old-timers who had once lived in Tombstone, he was also known to occasionally invent dialogue. It's worth noting that the standoff between Holliday and Ringo was reported on in various local papers, and not a single one of those accounts included the word Huckleberry. So just to sum things up, yes, I'm Your Huckleberry was a real phrase from the 19th century. And while I do think that the real Doc Holliday would have certainly understood its meaning, there's no evidence outside of Walter Noble Burns that Holliday himself ever actually uttered the phrase. And I guess that's about all I've got. But what do you think? Is the debate settled, or are people just going to keep arguing about it until Judgment Day? Email me at josh@wildwestextra.com or drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. Until next time, adios.